But yeah, welcome to everybody coming to the Sports Match webinar. Here we got a bunch of good recently matched fellow panelists here that are looking to impart some wisdom on all of us. We will first start off, I'll get with introductions here, but then we'll start off with a couple preset questions we have for them, but we'll be monitoring the chat as well. So feel free to throw questions in there. We'll kind of get them out there as we can. So we'll have a good action-packed hour here. So going through, we have fellows from every specialty here. From medicine, we got Katie Fairgrieve and Daniel Pallas. From family medicine, we got Brock Benedict, Beatrice Caballero, Raven Patel, and Lauren Wickman. From internal medicine, we have AJ Alston, Anna Bueller. From peds, we have Justin Chu, Carrie Wagner, Deanna Woolridge, and from PM&R, we have Carol Chang, Justin Foley, Jen Libby, and Josh Romero. And with that, we will get started. One second here. Edwin, do you have the preset questions up? I don't have them pulled up right here on this screen.
Yes, I do. Awesome. So everybody, we have a list of preset questions that we kind of generated from a pool, but I encourage everybody that as we develop and we go through the hour-long session, ask questions in the chat and we'll begin to pull them and kind of add to it, okay? So without further ado, let's start with the first one. And to the panel, whoever feels that they want to jump in and add to it, please go ahead. So first one, what were your top 3 priorities in choosing a fellowship program? Did you have these in mind prior to the interview? And did you refine them as you went through your interview process?
I think that's a good question. I think what you should first focus on for priorities is what do you want to do long term? Do you want to be with a college team? Do you want to be with a professional team? And just kind of figure out that. You should look at whether you want to be the only fellow or you want to have a co-fellow, whether you want to be at a big academic program or a community program. I think when I was in your shoes, I didn't know what I wanted. And then once you interview at a bunch of places, after you interview at a few spots, then you start to realize what you want and like what programs have and don't have. And then it kind of gets more specific as you go through the interview process.
I agree with Robin. Like when I was looking at different places, I also didn't quite know what I wanted really until I was there, either in person or on Zoom for my interview. And it was like during the interview process where I actually solidified wanting to be at an academic center over a community-based fellowship, even though I would still be happy at a community-based fellowship. But as far as like top priority, I would have preferred an academic center. And then also kind of like interviewing, you got the sense too of like what their ultrasound curriculum was like compared to others. And that was really important for me because that was one of the reasons why I decided to pursue a sports medicine fellowship. And then you can only get so much information about like what kind of sports coverage the place has really online unless you know somebody there. And so it was once again, like during the interview process where I was able to understand like, oh, do they have like specific sideline coverage opportunities that I was interested in, which was a little more of a niche sport. So I would say those 3 things were important, but also kind of found out during the interview trail.
Yeah, I think to build on that, so I think that, as everyone said so far, a lot of people have developed maybe to refine what they wanted as they went through the interview process. I think that what I would encourage you all to do is spend a lot of time up front trying to figure out what you want. And I think that can be multifaceted. So for example, I'll give you what I was thinking about. So ultrasound was a big part of what I was looking for. And I think as part of that, I kind of categorized orthobiologics and procedures as part of the ultrasound curriculum. That was one thing I kind of got going in. So when I went into fellowships, that was a big thing for me. Second, I really wanted a very kind of robust clinical experience. And to me, that meant getting exposure to all the primary specialties and getting experience in diverse settings. So some pro coverage, some local community college coverage, and then also getting some exposure with orthopedics as well. And then finally, I really always wanted to go into academic medicine. So for me, going to an institution where I could continue teaching and being involved in research was something that was a priority for me. Now, that list became more refined as I went through the interview process, but I certainly had those priorities kind of going into it as well. And so what I would say, looking back, as you'll see, there's a lot of variation in programs offer. And so I think trying to spend some time up front, really trying to identify what you want and then refining with there is really going to be helpful. And so I think that when you're in the middle of interview season, sometimes it's kind of hard because you're busy with your clinical responsibilities to spend a lot of time doing this. And so I think trying to put that upfront time thinking about this is really helpful.
Hey guys, my name is Danny. I'm one of the AMSSM, future SM fellows. So just adding to that, very, very much agree with everything. In the EM aspect as well, there's some programs that do offer the attending position too, and others where they have to look for an urgent care where you're gonna do that shift, because at the end, you're still have to work that one shift of primary care in your own specialty, right? In EM, it's an EM shift. So some places have it within the same structure, depending on the program, has its own shift, or if not, some places that are more community or they just probably don't have that ED association, like find an urgent care for you to do it. So it depends on what you want. And a lot of the priorities that you have when asking all these questions, it's always good for you to think, what do I want to do after, right? If you kind of know that, and that question will be there for sure. It's like, what are your goals in 3 and 5 years, right? So if you refine that question, what do you want to do after? You don't have to know the answer necessarily specifically, but just kind of have a sketch. If you have that already that thought process done, it will help you to see, okay, probably want to be here. Do you kind of have that to satisfy my goals? And again, it will be refined throughout the process, but at least it will give you an idea where to go. But just adding to the EM part, that's something that I asked as well. And as well, I'm an ultrasound fellow currently. I want to program with strong ultrasound part, plus the education. So again, there's a lot of many factors. And then at the end, you will say this one is more important than the other one, and it'll become easier down the road too.
One thing I wanted to add about the PM&R perspective. So with PM&R, you can apply for the primary care, or you can apply for the PM&R specific ones. So for me, I really wanted to have a program where there were PM&R physicians as well as the other specialties. And I wanted to continue my EMG skills and possibly some spinal injection. So those were kind of some PM&R things that I looked out for too.
I think some of the same things that you look for in a residency program also kind of follow through with your fellowship decision. So geographic ties, like I personally have done residency a long ways away from where I want to eventually end up. And so I was kind of intentional about being in a location that I was going to be able to build a little bit of a network and start that process. The sports medicine world is small, and I'm also emergency medicine, and the EM sports world is even smaller. So, some of that just happens with being a fellow, but that was certainly a consideration for me. And then I think one of the things that's really special about sports medicine in particular is, as is displayed by this panel, you have a ton of primary specialties who end up as sports medicine physicians. And so I was really looking for a program that had a lot of different sports med kind of backgrounds, because I think there's a lot to learn from every single one of them. So those are some priorities that I kind of considered as well.
I'm happy to hop in from so the first and most important part, I feel like, for pediatric residents is making sure the program accepts pediatric residents. And so our list is a little bit more limited in terms of what primary care sports medicine programs do take peds candidates. And so there's a really helpful list on the AMSSM site to make sure you would get accepted by that program. I've had some friends and folks in the past who've tried to kind of talk to programs and say, hey, like, maybe would you take someone from pediatrics? And some places have like strict ACGME rules, and so they cannot take somebody who's in a certain specialty. So that's important. And also thinking about how many people have trained in that particular program, making sure that they're comfortable training someone from specialty and that you're somebody who's kind of valued and your skill set is seen as something that's useful. I did an away rotation and I was able to see that firsthand and how that plays out at a children's hospital versus a non-children's hospital. So helpful as well to speak about away rotations later, but that was a helpful tool as well.
Thank you. And to kind of continue on what Dr. Wojcik's question, the next question kind of evolves that. Now that you all have gone through the actual fellowship process, is there anything you wish you would have known about prior to that process that would have made it feel a little bit easier, or a surprise to you that now that you're on the tail end that, oh, I wish I would have known about that in the future, that made you feel a bit more prepared?
So when I was interviewing, I was surprised at just how informal sports medicine interviews are. Everybody is nice. I am part of that. So I interviewed at both primary care, like adult primary care, and pediatrics as well. I mean, everybody was nice. Everybody was willing to talk with you. Half the interviews were just questions of like, so what's up? What teams you like? Things like that. I mean, it was just really easy. So that surprised me. Just because I do a lot of interviewing for residency as chief resident, and it's very, very formal and like very much a set number of questions that you ask everybody and that candidates also ask people. But sports medicine, at least for me, wasn't like that. Everybody just wanted to make sure that you were a normal person that they would get along with, because these fellowships are so small. So I wish I knew that. And then it just makes me a little bit more comfortable going into those interviews.
I think one thing I would add is if you have like a mentor or a fellow that you know, or someone who's matched previously, like don't hesitate to like ask them for help and or go over your list of, you know, programs and try to just get their sense of like what they think about those places. Because I think that can be really helpful just to get like someone else's take. Like you don't have to like keep a distance because suddenly now you're applying and, you know, like afraid to like step on someone's toes or something like that.
To continue on Dr. Bueller's, the next question kind of ties again that into that is, what were some of the go-to questions that you felt were helpful in learning more about the programs that you were able to ask while at the same time not feeling like you were, in a sense, stepping on toes, to kind of learn more about the program during the interview itself?
I cannot stress the importance of getting a sense of the program from the fellows. Have a conversation with the fellows who are there, see if you can get in touch with the previous year's fellows, since, you know, if you're interviewing in August, a lot of those people have been there for a month. There is, you know, a program director is always, of course, going to try to be honest, but they're going to really paint a picture of, I think sometimes it can be a little aspirational of what their goals for a program are. And so talking with the fellows about really what their day-to-day life is like, what they were looking for, what they've liked and what they haven't liked is such a key. It seems like the kind of chill part of most of the interviews, but I think there's so much valuable information there. I would really, you know, focus on that conversation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Katie. I think to go off that point is like, I ask a lot of questions in terms of, they'll throw out the word flexibility a lot in your schedule, but like truly how much flexibility is going to come down to the fellow who's actually doing it, like in terms of electives and stuff like that. So, you know, there's obviously a set amount of rotations that you're going to be doing, but getting a good sense of how much is kind of a make your own time and how much you have just for your personal time. Like, you know, we emphasize wellness in residency, but I think that moves forward with fellowship. And while it's a busy year, I think having that balance is going to be really, really important going forward.
I also think if you're going to a program where you're going to be the only fellow or two fellows, if you're like at a D1 program and you're going to be covering a lot of sports, you can ask the fellow or program director, what is your role as a fellow and what does coverage look like on a day-to-day? Because some are like, oh, you just go to the game and that's it. But some you go to training room, you go to practices, injury clinics. So just kind of understanding from the fellow perspective, like what is your role as what is your role when you are performing coverage at these games?
I think one thing I'd add, at least from a procedural standpoint, would be asking about specific numbers. So if a program asks, we do X, Y, and Z procedure, and you can just say, oh, on average, can you give me the numbers for your last few fellows? That could be for ultrasound or spine procedures or what have you. And I think that gives you a more objective value, because if they say they emphasize procedures, but they can't really give you those numbers, they may not emphasize that as much as they're really letting on. So that might be a good question to ask as well.
Oh, hello, Black Sportsman fellow.
Hi, I was going to say the same thing, Josh, echoing, just asking for specific numbers to figure out specific procedures that you might be interested in. Asking about those right off the bat can be helpful. And I think to echo, I think Dan's point from earlier, asking specifically what your primary specialty responsibilities might look like. I think that can look different from program to program. I know in family medicine, sometimes it's, you're paired with a family medicine doc in the community and doing clinic with them. At the program that I'm headed to next year, it is involved with being a preceptor at the residency clinic, which being interested in academics, I think that was something that was appealing to me too. So I think that was always a good question that I asked that I found to be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with Lauren. It was certainly really key in trying to ascertain what your primary clinic was going to look like. That seemed to vary quite a bit as I, interviewed with different programs. Especially getting a sense of if they've even had an IM, resident before, or an IM trained fellow before. And if they haven't, what their plans were going forward. Did they have IM faculty that were, willing to teach you and help you out, especially if you're going to be on your own in clinic. Another big question that I asked was any upcoming changes to the program. So trying to get a sense that they were open to feedback from past fellows about things that they could tweak, seeing if they had any internal personnel changes, whether they're adding on staff, taking staff away, things like that were really important to me.
Yeah, Justin Chi here, one of MedPeds residents. That was like one of my first questions. It was always like, what was your major takeaways, either positive or negative, from your annual program evaluation? Like, what would the fellows say that they wanted to change? And if the leadership not only heard those changes and if they were able to act on them and incorporate some of those changes. Another thing I like to kind of end with too is just kind of asking what their overall like proudest accomplishment was, whether it was like professionally or personally. I got a lot of cool different answers, and it showed me more of like an insight to like their genuine personality, just by some of their answers, because some of them was like, oh, I really don't have an answer, and then would think about it and let me kind of share mine too. But then some of them had like really cool family stories that I like to hear about, and kind of showed some true colors that I wouldn't think I've got the authenticity if I didn't ask that type of question.
I will also say for if research is like kind of one of your priorities, I always like to ask about like what kind of support that a fellow would have doing research, if it was like kind of running a project on your own, or if you had like resources at the program, and then get an idea of what some of the past fellows have done in terms of research as well.
Fantastic. We are getting quite a few questions coming in, and one of the first ones was, as of where we are now, what has been the percentage of interviews you all had that were still virtual versus the ones that were in person? And the ones that were, did that kind of throw anything off now that we've kind of gotten to the tail end of COVID, or possibly tail end of COVID?
So I'm comfortable sharing my like numbers. So I interviewed at 12 and 2 were in person. I think the advantage of in-person is, at least personally, I got such a different sense of those programs when I actually got to visit and sit in a room with people. I think that applies also with like if you do an away rotation, which I recommend that you do. Convenience wise and money wise, I don't know. I was like one of the last classes that interviewed in person for residency, and man, I just saved so much money doing virtual. So it has its pluses and minuses.
For me, about like 20% of my interviews were in person, but I will say none of my PM&R interviews were in person. They were all virtual. The only in-person ones were the family medicine programs that I applied to.
In my case, I didn't have any in-person interviews. I actually had only one option that had in person, but then the rest actually were virtual, and they stress the fact that they don't differentiate, but definitely to get the sense, it's always better getting to know them. And just to add to that really quickly, if you have the option of doing the MSSM, the conference, basically fellowship fair, that's where I met many fellowship directors that I'm a very vibe person, and I saw that vibe with them. I just shake their hand, they spoke like, this is what I'm interested in. They're like, oh, we totally have it. And then I had a talk with their fellows, and then that's where I met them. And I saw programs that I didn't even think about applying. And then that's a big surprise for me. This is great. They have this. I love how they interact between each other. So looking at that definitely makes it better. So if you don't have the option of going virtual, at least they provide you that option. They try pretty hard of giving their best impression there too.
All right, it looks like we're also kind of sharing in the chat as well. Looks like a pretty big variance between some having 100% virtual, and then other people having some more in person there. All right, we can go to the next question here. Can you share more of your experience about away sports med rotations? And then there's another question kind of similar to that. Were you able to match at those top programs that you're looking for if you didn't do an away rotation there?
So I did an away rotation, not necessarily at a program. My home program actually had a sports medicine program for residency, but I was applying for location-based. My wife was also matching to fellowship somewhere, and her fellowship match was earlier, so I was basically trying to try to follow wherever she was. So I needed to make myself look as good as possible. So I did an adult away rotation, which was phenomenal. It was great. I mean, peds, you don't do a lot of procedures in peds, but in adults, I mean, I did so many injections, and so that I could add that to a part of my application. That sets me apart from a little bit of the other peds. And if I was going to go to, a primary care family medicine fellowship, that I at least can come in with some experience as well. So I got a lot out of that rotation, and you just learn a lot from a different organization.
Very good. There's a question I think hits everyone pretty close, and I think it opened to everybody, obviously. What do you all feel was the biggest factor that differentiated you from all the other applicants during the process? Like, what experiences during residency that made you a more valuable candidate to the program?
I think for me, it was being on the SMRC council. I'm like coming from a community program that a lot of people don't know. So like just getting involved with the AMSSM is a big way if you're not coming from like a big academic institution that has a lot of research and faculty that have sports medicine. Getting involved in any capacity, whether you find a research project, there is a bunch of like mentorship available through AMSSM. So just getting involved with them and then being able to put that on your resume, it's a good talking point because a lot of the program directors and faculty are really big in AMSSM. So if you can connect with one of them, they all know each other. So it's really good to have in your resume.
I think that question is a little hard to answer in some ways because I think that, you don't know people's applications, so it's hard to know what you're going up against per se. I personally always feel that having an application that's genuine to who you are and who you want to become is very important. And so I think, for example, if you're saying you really want to prioritize research or education, I think having an application that demonstrates that you prioritize and have tried to take advantage of opportunities residency to do that, I think is really good. I think at the end of the day, you can only be the best version of yourself. And so I think that that's what I would encourage you to do is just chase things you enjoy and chase things you're generally passionate about, not so much just to pad the CV. And I think if you do that, you're gonna find a program, you're gonna find something that prioritizes things that you also prioritize. So I think that's what I would just say. I mean, maybe that's a little philosophical or not, but I think that's how I kind of approach things.
Actually, totally agree with what you're saying there, Josh. Like one thing I would just say is like, one thing I kept saying in my interviews is like my passion for teaching, and I wanted to be an active teacher as a fellow. One of the reasons I wanted to like stay in education. Also, I want to be someone who actively is working on my leadership skills and becoming a better leader. And so one thing that I pursued during residency was actually like college classes in like the development of being a leader, in like how to be a good mentor, how to be someone who takes feedback. And a lot of people commented on taking those classes, but it really, like what Josh said, it really like my actions matched my words, which matched my passion. And I don't think it was like the class, right, that made me stick out. It was because I had that passion and all of those things lined up. Like I was who I was on my CV. And I think that really stuck out to them. Like, yeah, she wanted this and she went after it, and she is who she is.
Hey, this is Brock. I'm just going to take this question as an opportunity to throw out there my unique situation. So I've been an active duty family physician in the U.S. Army for 19 years, which makes me a very atypical future fellow. So in the event there's anybody out there listening in that may, be active duty or a military background that's got some, very specific questions that I may be able to answer, I'd be happy to do that and can share my information with Joan for contact if you want to talk offline specifically within that domain. But, to answer the question, I think that's what set me apart uniquely to match at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And that was really based on proximity for me. A lot of it had to do with geography, because I'll finish that fellowship and then return back to active duty Army service. But if you're prepping for an interview and you want to figure out how to set yourself apart, I would highly recommend to Google Pat Lencioni's Humble, Hungry, Smart. And it's an entire book, but there's some really good, Reader's Digest versions of those interview questions that Pat Lencioni puts out there, and then how to prepare, how to answer those. I think they're both helpful to develop questions for the fellowship, but also to develop your own answers to specifically, be yourself. But it's a really good Humble, Hungry, Smart, Pat Lencioni. I use it regularly, probably once a quarter, as I assess folks that come work for me within the Army domain.
I think one thing to add is just like, I think even prior to like applying to med school, the advice I was given was like show, don't tell, and kind of like show them, what you're going to bring to that med school residency fellowship. And so I think when you're talking about kind of all of your interests and things, it's not like just, we all think sports medicine is fun, that's for sure. But like, what are the kind of things that you might bring to their program? And that can come from your interest, but like, how would you potentially contribute, whether that's research, teaching, other experiences that other people don't have. That's kind of the way to, I think, frame who you are.
One thing that I wanted to add that's a little bit more specific is if you do a bunch of sports coverage, it's good to differentiate if you were there kind of shadowing and attending, or you were more autonomous and kind of the lead, like just you with an athletic trainer or something, because that can actually differentiate your experience on your CV.
And to bounce off of what Carol's saying, I think one thing that it might be kind of helpful in the application that I was told was it kind of like what Josh was getting at, like padding your CV, having a million different experiences for like every single game you covered, it can get really lost in the weeds pretty easily. So I was told when I was going through, and so this is what I did, and I guess it worked. I split it up as like a few different sections. So I had sports medicine rotations, and those were all the rotations I did through medical school, residency, all the different preceptors. And then I did like a medical school coverage and then a residency coverage, and kind of summarized, just like Carol was saying, in brief statements, my role, whether it was, this team for a season, this mass coverage event, etc. That I think made it a little bit easier to read through rather than trying to sort through, okay, which season did you cover, which year, and that kind of thing.
I just want to add quickly too with like the sports coverage, and this is going to be emphasized throughout your interviews, but I had a lot of conversations around like it was more like quality over quantity type thing. Like you stuck with one team and you stuck with them for as long as you could while you're a busy resident. But I had a lot more to kind of expand upon as far as like, sure, the experience as far as like procedures and management and stuff like that, but you can actually maybe build more relationships with like the trainers and the athletes. And I think that led for a lot of nice conversations, just to see that you started something and kind of see it to its end. And that's the same to say with research, although that can be quite hard. Research is, hard to finish in 3 years or even longer than that. But if you start something, try to tie up those loose ends versus, jumping all over the place, I think is something that was, at least for me, brought up quite a bit.
All right. Plenty of great questions coming in the chat here. We're going to try to get through a couple more of our preset questions here. This one's kind of been touched on a little bit, and I imagine it will vary from person to person, but one of the questions here is, did you have a lot of research or volunteer/coverage experience going into fellowship?
I was lucky at my program that we as residents are allowed to do moonlighting. We get paid to do sports medicine coverage. So that was excellent. It was just us and the athletic trainer with a couple of the teams. And plus, since we had a fellowship there, we could also go to other games that the fellows were covering if we wanted to, obviously not for moonlighting. But we had a lot of opportunities for that coverage. COVID certainly had an impact on what was being played and who could go where. So it was a little bit difficult to find coverage sometimes. But overall, I'd say that getting a diverse experience of coverage is really helpful just to talk about and find what you're interested in as well.
I think part of this depends on your background and then what specialty you're coming from. So, if you are at a place that has, you're associated with a university and you have access to those things, like that might be a little bit easier for you. And so I think just getting involved with what you can, being genuine about it, and then leaning into your past experience. Like personally, I was an athletic trainer, so I spent a lot of time on the sidelines, and I talked about that in my application. I'm also an EM applicant, so I don't have like a clinic month where I'm reliably free in the weekends or evenings. And so I think if you take advantage of the opportunities that come up, then you should be fine. But
I feel like I could give a good answer here because I kind of come from a unique program where we don't have a sports medicine position on faculty. And I also didn't decide to pursue sports medicine until during residency. And so my sports coverage was nothing until later in my second year of residency. And then I had to actually seek out a sports medicine position completely outside of our hospital system to see if they'd be willing to let me shadow them. And as you all know, sports medicine physicians are very friendly and great. And so once I made that connection, he was like, yes, come on. So hopefully to any of you that are worried about not having years and years of coverage, like I literally had maybe a year of coverage before I applied. But once I decided I wanted to do sports medicine, kind of like what people are saying, like I stuck with it, right? And tried to get that continuity, tried to go as many games as I could with the same college, with the same people. And then regarding research, I actually didn't have any like publications. And I got into my #1 program. I just had like posters. So like sort of published, but like not like didn't do like any like randomized controlled trials or fancy publications, just posters.
I'll piggyback on that one because I did not have much of that research on EM, and EM is usually not the most research specialty course, there are people, but not me specifically. So I was worried a little bit about that too. Yet again, I had one that I jumped in and said, hey, if I'm going to do something, luckily something I like. I'm associated with a university school, so they had a lot of event coverage. So I did that continuity for 1 year during my last year of residency. Besides that, I had 0 away rotations. Just we do have a sports medicine rotation that I actually use it as every elective because in COVID didn't allow us to travel either. So I thought that was going to be a deficiency, but luckily it wasn't. I did finish in my #1 program too, and it was pretty academic too. So luckily it worked out. But I would say what they told me in the fellowship last year, the attendings that were actually program directors of different programs told me as well, just be the best version of yourself as a resident. Like, be the best resident you can, right? If you're going to work hard, try to be the best version you can right now, like your present self. Of course, focus on what you want, go with it. If you see opportunities, great, use them. If not, try to create them somehow as well. Reach out to people. Luckily, as we're here with everyone, sportsmen, people are really nice and they will help you with it. So that's basically what my recommendation too.
Hey, Matt. No, there's no need.
Yeah, I would say for me early on.
AJ, I think you're muted right now.
Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, for me early on in residency as an intern, I reached out to a sports med PD just to get a sense of what coverage opportunities were available to me, especially in the setting of COVID, what kind of events were still happening. So I ended up doing like a lot of combat sports like boxing and MMA, just because they were not associated with like high schools and things like that. So I was able to get a lot of coverage with those. And then for the research piece, I ended up just jumping on a project that the sports medicine fellows at the program that was associated with mine were doing that year, and just kind of help them out while they were doing their project for the year. And then once they had graduated, I just kind of kept doing the data analysis and then ended up presenting it at a local conference. So that way I didn't really have to like come up with my own idea or anything original, but just a project that was already in place that I was able to continue since, I had the advantage of time and having more time in residency to work on it than you can in just a 1-year sports medicine fellowship. So if you have the opportunity, if you have a program that's local, I would certainly just reach out to the PD and ask them, what coverage opportunities are there? Are the current fellows doing any research projects? And if you find any of them interesting, that might be a good way to get some exposure.
AJ, I actually really like what you're saying there. You mentioned like just reaching out, and if there's one thing I could hope that everyone takes away from this, it would be just reach out. Like, regardless of whether you go to a program where there's lots of sports medicine coverage opportunities or literally 0, the sports medicine community is very welcoming and very open. So I would really encourage you to just find any local sports medicine physician, whether in your hospital system or outside your hospital system, and just get connected with them, and they can connect you to other sports medicine physicians. Come to AMSSM, connect to AMSSM, come say hi to us at AMSSM, and just reach out and, make the opportunities for yourself, and you can do well.
I think just to kind of build off that, I think going back to the research piece just for a moment here, I'm somebody who did a decent amount of research in residency, and part of that's just where I trained for residency. But I think a question that comes up often is, how much research do you need? And I don't know that there's really a black and white answer to that question. I think that again, it's not so much about quantity, I think it's more about quality. And part of this depends on where you train, what opportunities are available, that kind of thing. So I think, again, really trying to focus on quality experiences over quantity. And really what you're trying to learn with going through research is that you're trying to just learn the process. So I don't think people expect you to have like a randomized control trial by the end of residency. I think it's more about, can you take a project from beginning to end and learn that process? So I think focus on experiences that kind of allow you to do so. I think that's more helpful than any one quantity on publications or presentations or anything of that matter. So just kind of want to put a plug in for that.
Since we're talking about all these experiences, I can't stress how important it is to keep your CV just active and running, because you're not going to remember when you did that last football game or what date it was. When you update your CV, it doesn't have to be perfect with, you know, the little blurb on your bullet points or anything. Just like have the experience that you did, just write a little something, write the date on your CV, and it's going to save you a lot of time when it comes to actually sitting down and putting your application together.
Fantastic. Kind of an interesting question we got in chat. Looking even past fellowship, when you're thinking of where you wanted to set up your practice in the future, how important was it in your experience and just the conversations you had of picking a location of the fellowship to the location you wish to practice? And is there any kind of opportunity there to establish yourself, or is that even really a huge variable to be able to find a place to be where you want to finally be after fellowship?
I know I said earlier that I mostly just followed my wife to wherever she matched a fellowship. But something I did ask in every interview was, what does the landscape look like? Because her fellowship is 3 years, so I'm going to need a job. This fellowship is 1 year. Like, what is that? What is my next 2 years going to look like, or more if we're staying there? You know, so I asked that in every interview, and got a lot of different answers, but those answers were really helpful. And most programs were extremely honest of like, hey, we just hired somebody, so we're not going to have a full-time position available for a while, or, oh, you know, I think that we actually have something coming up. We're opening a new office and whatever. But I think asking that question directly during an interview is very important. All right. Another question here. Any red flags that you would recommend looking out for through the interview process?
I think the biggest thing, especially when you're interviewing, to look at is interactions between the faculty and the fellows. You can really tell the programs that are genuine, they get along with their like fellow and attendings, and you can ask them. But I could definitely tell a few of the programs I interviewed at, like, it was very like, you're the fellow, I'm the attending, and there was a separation. But a lot of like 90% of the programs I interviewed at was like very collegial, and everyone seemed like they got along really well. So just, you can really tell that off Zoom even for the interview. So if they don't seem like they get along, that's kind of a red flag in my book.
I agree. I had one interview where the fellow seemed miserable and didn't have much to say about the program. And I was like, whoo, big red flag.
Or if the fellow just did not show up to the interview. It's like, well, okay, they were listed as an interviewer for me, so I don't know what happened. Maybe something came up, but same to say with like residency interviews, like none of the residents show up to happy hour. I feel like that's a good idea of, well, sure, they're busy, but I don't know. I think that's something I looked out for.
There's a few programs where they might have like a virtual happy hour before, and like you should definitely try to go to that if you can. Or just like even pay attention in the kind of chatter before the interview starts, because I feel like you can get a sense of just like the dynamics of people. And yeah, like you're mostly not in person, so you're not going to get that perspective that we've gotten before, like with our residency interviews. But I think any little opportunity to kind of just see how people interact is really important.
I think red flags is a little bit more personal when you're doing within fellowship interviews versus residency, because I remember in residency interviews you're like, anybody, I don't care, just please pick me. But fellowship, you kind of get to choose exactly what you want. So some of these red flags doesn't necessarily have to be like something bad with the program, but it's more like, oh, they just don't have something that I'm looking for. So I think that's something that you have to keep in mind, that you're also choosing this experience. And if they don't have a lot of ultrasound and you're looking for that, like, you know, maybe that's not the place for you, and that's okay. So definitely remember that.
I think one other thing to kind of build off that is, with everything being virtual, or at least for the majority of interviews being virtual, I think looking for the small things. So for me, like looking at organization, how the program's interactive with via email before the interview, the organization of the interview day, and any communication thereafter, I thought was really important. And so there were some programs that you could tell were very, very organized, and some where it seemed like a lot of things were kind of going wrong very frequently. And so I think that was something else I kind of paid attention to as well, because these people are going to be creating their schedules and all that thing going forward. So attention to detail to me was important.
Yeah, I'd echo. I had the exact same thought, Josh, about the importance of just seeing how things are run, especially since, at the end, or from the perspective of the program coordinators, since you're going to be working with them quite a bit. Even now, you're already working with them for onboarding process. So getting a sense of how organized they are, if they're paying attention to details, because that will make a huge difference for your fellowship year.
I think another thing too that I just popped into my head is like, and I don't want to call this a red flag, but maybe just something to think about is if there's no fellows or faculty from that institution who stick like zero, like hired after fellowship, or like and people move for different reasons, they end up where they end up. But I think something I looked for were like, do these people stick around, at least in the area? And I think that's a good thing to look out for. Again, could their career choices, a lot of different things factor into it, but I think something to keep an eye out for.
Another thing that I would say that is not necessarily a red flag, but some questions you may ask is some programs have coverage, like clinic coverage, AM and PM in different locations. Some places are very busy, traffic. I don't know. If you love that program and that's not a thing, totally okay. But it's something else just to have in mind. Like I'm going to have to drive here and there. Adds to stress on a daily basis. But again, it depends on many other things. Just something extra there.
Yeah, I like the positive attitude everyone's bringing, not negative red flags, like a lot of green flags, But yeah, for me too, I kind of looked into, there's some parts where like I didn't know how far away some of the clinics were in terms of half days, and they didn't tell you that. And I was just like, oh, look, these are like 35 minutes apart if you have to drive. And not knowing that, I kind of had to do a little bit more research. But some programs were explicit upfront, saying like they showed maps of like this is where you would be at between where the training room is and where the clinic is. And then kind of that same light, I kind of looked for like what Josh was saying too, the organization of the program as like a main kind of marker of how like professional they were, and how you could tell that everyone top down is really in line. So again, I kind of looked for more green flags, because some programs are even like with time differences. Like I got a couple kids and they got sick, they were able to be flexible and change the schedule and be upfront on top of it and everything, which was helpful for me. And that flexibility from them kind of showed to me like how they're willing to work for their trainees and applicants. Again, showed green flag. So look, sometimes you can look for more green than you would red, because again, you're going to apply to these programs. You're probably going to only apply to places you really want to go, right? So right off the bat, you shouldn't be applying for places you're kind of wishy-washy about, because you're just wasting your own time. So from that off the bat, most of your programs won't have many red flags, because you should be selective on what programs you're applying to.
I think one other thing that I noticed was some programs are a little bit more like flexible with how they define your primary specialty clinic time. And so like if you really care about being in like a true family med or internal medicine clinic, like some places will have that for you, and some places will have you just be doing more like training room, and consider that like the primary care time, because you're covering a lot of like primary care complaints, but for the athletes. And I'm not sure how that plays out for like peds or PM&R necessarily, or I think EM is pretty particular. But I just noticed some places it's more defined, and they're very like proud of like maintaining their primary specialty and being in sports med. And then other places are mostly like sports med, and even for your own kind of like continuity half days, you're still doing mostly sports med.
Fantastic. Well, we're almost at that hour. We got about that's 8 minutes, so we'll get one more in. In all your interview experiences, was there anything particularly you were surprised about during the interview of whichever program that you felt was something that would have been nice to know before, or just something that was particularly interesting that caught you off guard?
I think we all kind of intuitively know this, but it is such a small world. Everyone knows everyone. And so, building connections, making good impressions are really important. Being positive about your other experiences, like to not be bad mouthing other programs. And, remember that no matter where you land, like you are going to be colleagues with all of the people that you are interviewing with. And so keeping that in mind, like as you go through, I think is important. Obviously you should be a good applicant either way, but, or a good interviewer either way, but remember, like you're going to see all these people again. We will all be colleagues someday.
I think one of the things I found interesting from a fellowship perspective versus residency interview, a lot of the time is spent you asking questions. So in the beginning, I was like running out of questions to ask. So when you're preparing for interviews, just have your like list of 10 questions. Because a lot of interviews are like, oh, I've been talking all day. Like, let's just hear from you. And they'll just like sit there for 10, 15 minutes in the room and just like have you asking them questions. So having a list ahead of time is really helpful.
I found it helpful too. Like sometimes they'll give you the interviewers that you're interviewing with, and I would look up who they were and maybe what their primary role was within the fellowship, just because I completely agree with Robin's point. Like a lot of it was me asking questions, so it was helpful to know a little bit about them, so I could say, oh, I know your team doc for this, what tell me about that experience, or whatever that might have been. So I thought that was pretty helpful.
Fantastic. I think we're coming up to the last few minutes. If there's any other last minute questions, we'll keep an eye on the chat, but I want to take this opportunity to thank every single member of the panel who took the time out of your day to come and share your experiences, share your thoughts. I can already see from just the sheer activity that was hard enough as it is to keep up with on the chat, that there was a lot of interaction, a lot of questions answered. And if there's any final thoughts, final concerns, final ideas that you wish to share with them, please, the floor is yours.
I have one final. Oh, go ahead. No. Oh, well, I'll go with one final thought related to personal statements. Just because I read probably 200 personal statements for residents, and it's difficult to make your personal statement interesting, but do try your best, because by the time, people are reading so many personal statements, right? And looking at the first paragraph to the last paragraph, sometimes you don't make it all the way down. And that's not because they don't care about what you're saying. Everybody wants to be a sports medicine fellow. Everybody has that specific injury that made them love, sports medicine or whatever it is. So how do you know something is interesting? I would just encourage you, somebody who does not do sports medicine, or somebody who does not know you like a family member, to read your personal statement. And it was like, hey, was this at least interesting enough to get through? Just have somebody like that read your personal statement.
One more thing really quickly. I did as well, just as Carrie, I couples matched. It's not a thing, but my wife went into internal medicine to rheumatology. So hers was a month early, and our priority was be together. So wherever she got an interview, I sent a follow-up email saying, my wife got here, we want to be together, and we sent an email, because sometimes, like, I'm more on the east side, the west programs don't look necessarily east that much, but if you specifically say why you're interested in that program and doing it early, they look at your application and say, oh wow, that's pretty nice, so they would consider you earlier too. So do that early. Same for her, she did it for me, so it's something else that you could do if you're in that particular situation.
Yeah, I got lucky that actually one of my letter writers included a paragraph that I was couples matching the same with my wife, so that it always came up in every interview. They always asked like what she was doing and where she was going to try to go.
Yeah, I would just say enjoy the process of the application. It's a kind of fun time to reflect on all the accomplishments and you've done to get to the point to where you're at, and you can kind of like look forward to your future too, and enjoy the ride, because you're gonna have that feeling where people want to, again, just like residency, they want you to work with them, then they want you to be a part of their team, and it's great to be wanted. So just soak it in, enjoy it. You worked really hard for it, so congrats, have fun.
Very good. Well, I feel like this was a very jam-packed hour. I think a lot of great information was shared. The list is, the chat is all the contact information or emails that are being populated by our panelists. Please feel free to use it. Feel free to reach out. And yes, thank you so much. I believe this information will be, this all been recorded, so this should be able to be accessed at a later point. Ms. Joan, are you still there?
Yes.
Sounds good. Well, we've hit exactly at the hour. Again, I'd like to thank everybody who was participating. This was a wonderful experience. And that concludes the webinar. If there's any questions, again, please reach out.